In the summer of 1942, something extraordinary was happening in the North African desert. Small columns of modified American Jeeps were racing across hundreds of miles of open sand, slipping past German and Italian positions and appearing out of nowhere to attack enemy airfields with devastating effect, a handful of men in. These vehicles claimed to have destroyed more Axis aircraft than the Royal Air Force managed through conventional combat during the same period, and they nearly never existed at all. The Special Air Service, founded in July 1941 by a 25-year-old lieutenant on crutches, began as one of the most audacious gambles in British military history. A unit of fewer than 70 men proposed to achieve what entire brigades could not, the SAS's North African campaign, spanning from its catastrophic first operation in November 1941 to David Stirling's capture in January 1943. Claimed destruction of an estimated 250 to 400 enemy aircraft. While these figures remain disputed against German records, what is undeniable is that the unit forced RML to divert precious troops to guard rear area airfields. The unit that British military bureaucrats actively wanted to fail became the template for every modern special forces organization in the Western world. The story of how this happened is also the story of a vehicle, not a British vehicle at all, but an American one, the Willys Jeep, designed in Ohio as a simple runabout, would be transformed by British ingenuity into the deadliest desert raider of the Second World War. But to understand how that transformation occurred, we must first understand the men who made it happen and the desperate circumstances that gave birth to their unit. By the summer of 1941, the British position in North Africa was precarious. The Desert Fox, German Field Marshal RML, had arrived in Libya in February with his Afrika Korps and immediately begun pushing British forces back toward Egypt. The garrison was besieged. The Royal Air Force was struggling to maintain air superiority over the Libyan airfields, from which German and Italian aircraft launched attacks on Allied shipping and troops. Something had to change, and it would take an unconventional mind to see what that something might be. David Stirling was by most conventional measures a terrible soldier. Born on the 15th of November 1915 in London at 15 Cambridge Square to a Scottish aristocratic family, he was the son of Brigadier General Stirling of Keir. The family seat, Keir House in Perth, was where he spent his childhood, but London was his birthplace. Educated at college and sent down from Cambridge University. After a year of drinking and gambling, he stood 65 tall, with the build of the mountaineer he had trained to become before the war, interrupted his plans to climb Everest. Stirling had joined the Scots Guards Supplementary Reserve in 1937 and served with No. 8 Guards Commando. Colonel Robert as part of, but his military record was far from distinguished. He had nearly been charged with, and his superior officers viewed him with a mixture of exasperation and amusement. When was disbanded on the 1st of August 1941, after suffering heavy casualties during the evacuation of Cree, Stirling was recovering in a Cairo hospital from a spinal injury sustained during an experimental parachute jump. The jump had gone badly wrong, and Stirling had spent weeks unable to walk, lying in a hospital bed with nothing to do but think. It was during this enforced that Stirling crystallized his radical insight. He had seen how conventional commando raids operated. Large forces of 200 or more men would be assembled, transported by ship or aircraft to their objective, and then deployed in mass attacks. The operations were complex, required enormous coordination, and were easily detected. The enemy had learned to watch for them. Raid after raid was cancelled at the last moment when surprise was lost, and when raids did proceed, casualties were often severe. Stirling argued the opposite approach. He believed that small teams of 4 to 5 men, operating with stealth and mobility across the vast unguarded desert flanks, could destroy more aircraft and supplies than an entire commando unit operating together. The key insight was the desert itself. Unlike the European theater, where front lines were continuous, the North African campaign featured enormous gaps in the lines. The desert was simply too vast to garrison completely. Small teams could slip through these gaps, travel hundreds of miles undetected, strike their targets, and disappear back into the sand sea before the enemy even knew they had been there. Stirling composed a memorandum outlining this concept in precise detail. He proposed a unit of roughly 200 men organized into small detachments who would be trained in demolitions, desert navigation, and survival. They would strike airfields Supply dumps and communication lines deep behind enemy positions, the targets, would be so far from the front that they would be virtually unguarded, the cumulative effect of repeated small attacks would be crippling to enemy morale and logistics. The problem was getting anyone to read his memorandum. Stirling was a junior lieutenant, barely recovered from injury with a reputation for the senior. Officers at Middle East headquarters had more pressing concerns than listening to unconventional ideas from who couldn't even complete a parachute jump without hurting themselves. The traditional account of what happened next has become legendary. It holds that Stirling, still on crutches, bluffed and climbed his way past sentries at Middle East headquarters in Cairo, slipping under a gap in the perimeter fence when guards refused him entry, moving as quickly as his injured back would allow. He made his way into the headquarters building and stumbled into the office of Major General Deputy Chief of Staff. Before anyone could throw him out, he handed over his memorandum. Historians 2022. Biography presents a different version, argues it was actually Stirling's elder brother, Bill, already working at headquarters in a staff position, who ensured the proposal reached the right desks. The truth may involve elements of both accounts. What matters is that read the memorandum, found its logic compelling, and championed the idea to General Sir, the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief Middle East Forces, was under intense pressure from Prime Minister Churchill to mount an offensive against RML. He needed results, and he was willing to consider unconventional approaches that might deliver them. 3 days after receiving Stirling's memorandum, met the young lieutenant personally, promoted him to captain on the spot, and authorized the recruitment of 6 officers and 60 men. The unit was designated L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The name was a deliberate piece of deception, and understanding it reveals something important about the fog of war that made the SAS possible. Brigadier Dudley Clark was running a sophisticated deception operation called a force from Cairo. One of his schemes was the creation of a Phantom K detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, complete with fake unit insignia, photographs, and deliberately leaked intelligence. The purpose was to convince the Axis that a full 5,000-man British parachute brigade existed in North Africa, ready to drop behind RML's lines at any moment. The Phantom unit was so convincing that it had already caused the Germans to divert troops and aircraft to counter a threat that did not exist. Stirling's real unit became L Detachment, implying the existence of detachments A through K. The fictional element was designated K Detachment, making Stirling's tiny force appear to be just one component of a much larger formation. It was deception layered upon deception, and it bought the SAS precious room to operate in its vulnerable early days. But if had authorized the unit's creation, the middle and lower ranks of Middle East headquarters had not. Staff officers were openly hostile. Bureaucrats tried to block Stirling's recruitment of officers from the disbanded. They refused to provide adequate equipment, supplies, or transport. Every request was delayed or simply ignored. The SAS's first operation became a theft. Stirling and his men raided a nearby New Zealand regiment's camp, stealing tents, bedding, and even a piano to furnish their new headquarters at a desolate camp on the Great Bitter Lake. Staff officers at headquarters were described as actively wanting the SAS to fail, hoping its inevitable collapse would vindicate their opposition and prevent future unconventional units from disrupting the proper order of military hierarchy. Stirling would later describe these officers with characteristic bluntness as fossilized. The men Stirling recruited were a remarkable collection of misfits, adventurers, and natural warriors. They came from disbanded commando units, from the long-range desert group, from regular infantry battalions where their independent thinking had made them unwelcome. What they shared was a willingness to volunteer for missions that promised extreme danger with uncertain reward. The training program that awaited them was devised not by Stirling, but by a man who, by Stirling's own admission, was far more genuinely the founder of the SAS, Lieutenant John Steele Lewes, known universally as Jock, was born on the 21st of December 1913 in Kolkata, India, where his father worked as a chartered accountant. Raised in Australia and educated at Christ Church, Oxford, where he was president of the University Boat Club and rowed for the Oxford 8, was an intellectual, an athlete, and a natural leader who had joined the Welsh Guards before transferring to commandos, where Stirling provided the political vision and the social connections needed to keep the unit alive in the face of bureaucratic opposition. LSE built everything else. He designed the training program, a punishing regimen of desert survival, weapons handling, demolitions, and celestial navigation that would transform civilian soldiers into silent killers capable of operating for weeks behind enemy lines. He established the principle that every SAS man must be trained in every skill so that a team could continue to function even after suffering casualties. He instilled the discipline and attention to detail that would mean the difference between life and death in the desert. Most importantly, LSE invented the weapon that made the SAS effective. Existing demolition charges were poorly suited to destroying aircraft. Standard explosives would blow holes in fuselages but often left aircraft repairable. Devices could start fires but might not destroy the target completely. The SAS needed something that would both detonate and burn, ensuring that every aircraft attacked was completely destroyed. After weeks of experimentation, LSE developed his solution. The bomb consisted of roughly 1 pound of plastic explosive designated Nobel 808, mixed with approximately a quarter pound of thermite and bound with diesel oil. Additional components included steel filings and a 2.0 dry gun cotton booster with a 30-second time delay fuse. Complete device weighed about 1 pound, small enough that a single man could carry a dozen of them. When detonated, the explosive would rupture fuel tanks while the thermite would ignite the aviation fuel, ensuring complete destruction. It was elegant, portable, and devastatingly effective. Every aircraft killed by the SAS in their raids was killed by a Lewes bomb, the third founding member of what would become the SAS's wartime leadership. Was as different from the aristocratic Stirling and the intellectual LSC as it was possible to be. Blair Robert Mayne was born on the 11th of January 1915 in Newtowns, County Down in what was then Ireland. The son of a prosperous family, he had become a qualified solicitor, but his true calling was violence, the controlled violence of sport and the uncontrolled violence of combat. Mayne was the Irish University's heavyweight boxing champion. He won 6 international rugby caps for Ireland, playing as a lock forward between February 1937 and March 1939. In 1938, he South Africa with the British and Irish Lions, earning 3 test caps. He stood 6'3" and tall and weighed 217, most of it muscle. His fellow soldiers called him, and they approached him with a mixture of admiration and weariness. Mayne had temper, and when it was roused, the results were memorable. He was recruited into the SAS, reportedly from a prison cell where he was awaiting court-martial for striking his commanding officer. The circumstances of the incident varied depending on who told the story, but the essential fact was that Mayne had been facing the end of his military career when Stirling appeared with an offer of redemption. Mayne would become the SAS's greatest warrior, but in those early days he was simply one more recruit, learning to plant Lewes bombs and navigate by the stars. The SAS's first combat operation was launched on the night of the 16th to 17th of November 1941 in support of Operation Crusader, the major British offensive intended to relieve the besieged garrison at the plan. Operation Squatter called for 55 men, 5 sticks to parachute from Bristol Bombay aircraft onto drop zones near 5-axis airfields at N. They would plant bombs on parked aircraft, then march 50 mi south through the desert to with the desert group who would transport them back to friendly lines. The weather forecast was atrocious. Meteorologists predicted gale force winds of 30 knots, twice the safe limit. For parachuting, Stirling faced an impossible choice. If he, the operation headquarters, would use the failure to justify disbanding the unit before it had accomplished anything. If he proceeded, his men might be scattered across the desert, unable to reach their targets or their extraction point. Stirling chose to proceed. The 5 stick leaders were Stirling himself, Paddy, Mayne, Jock, Lieutenant A.O., and Lieutenant Charles. They boarded their aircraft on the evening of the 16th of November and flew out over the desert toward the enemy airfields. What followed was a catastrophe. The winds reached force 7 to 8, driving a massive sandstorm that reduced visibility to nearly zero. Pilots flew blind, unable to see the ground or their drop zones. One aircraft carrying Lieutenant and his men was shot down by a German night fighter. The others dropped their parachutists as best they could, but the howling wind scattered men and equipment across miles of desert. Equipment containers carrying the precious LSE bombs were torn from their parachutes and lost. Explosives that were recovered had been soaked by rain that had preceded the sandstorm. Men landed miles from their intended drop zones, their navigation equipment damaged or missing. Squads that managed to assemble found Themselves hopelessly lost, their targets unreachable before dawn would expose them to enemy aircraft. Single shot was fired at the enemy that night. Not a single Lewis bomb detonated on an Axis aircraft. Of the 55 men who had jumped, only 21 or 22 straggled back to the long-range desert group. Over the following days, Lieutenant died of injuries sustained during his landing. The rest were dead, captured, or lost in the desert. Operation Squatter was a complete and total failure. Any reasonable assessment would have concluded that the SAS experiment was over. Stirling's theories had been tested against reality, and reality had won. The sensible course would be to distribute the surviving men back to their original units and forget that L detachment had ever existed. The staff officers at Middle East headquarters certainly expected this outcome and were already preparing to process the unit's disbandment. But during the long, slow journey back from the disaster in the desert group's trucks, Stirling was not thinking about failure, he was thinking about the trucks themselves. If the desert group could extract his men from deep in the desert, why couldn't they insert them? The parachute drop had failed because of uncontrollable weather. Vehicle insertion would eliminate that variable entirely. Stirling approached Captain David Owen, commander of the Desert Group patrol that had rescued his men, with a proposal. The Desert Group had been operating deep in enemy-held territory since 1940, running reconnaissance missions and occasionally attacking targets of opportunity. They knew the desert better than anyone. What if they transported SAS raiding parties to within striking distance of enemy airfields, dropped them off, and returned to pick them up after the attack? Owen agreed to present the idea to his commander, and the Desert Group's leadership agreed to a trial. Just 1 month after the disaster of Operation Squatter, on the 14th of December 1941, the SAS launched its first successful operations. 3 raiding parties were transported by long-range Desert Group vehicles to points near enemy airfields, then proceeded on foot to their targets. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Except possibly, Mayne led his team against airfield, approaching through the darkness on foot until they reached the perimeter. What happened next demonstrated why Mayne would become the most feared commando of the North African campaign. Finding the officers' mess still lit and occupied, Mayne burst through the door, surprising approximately 30 Axis at dinner. He opened fire with his pistol, then and began systematically moving through the parked aircraft, planting Lewis bombs on each one. The SAS claimed 24 aircraft destroyed at that night with 0 British casualties. When Mayne ran out of explosives before he ran out of targets, he reportedly climbed into the cockpit of one remaining aircraft and tore the instrument panel out with his bare hands, ensuring it would never fly again. On the 21st to 22nd of December, Lieutenant Bill Fraser's team hit airfield further into Axis territory. The SAS claimed up to 37 aircraft destroyed, though German records examined after the war indicate the actual number was closer to 25. The discrepancy between SAS claims and Axis records would become a recurring theme, but even the lower number represented a remarkable achievement for 5 men with no support. Across multiple raids that December, the SAS claimed approximately 60 enemy aircraft destroyed without a single man killed in action. The concept that staff officers had dismissed as impossible was proven. General promoted Stirling to major and authorized expansion of the unit, but success carried its own price. On the 31st of December 1941, Jock was returning from a raid on airfield in a Desert Group truck when the convoy was spotted. German aircraft, a 110, made repeated strafing runs on the exposed vehicles. A 20 cannon round struck in the leg, severing his femoral artery. He bled to death in 4 minutes, surrounded by men who had no way to stop the hemorrhage. He was 28 years old. Lewes's death was a devastating blow. He had been the intellectual architect of everything that made the SAS function, and his loss was felt deeply by every man who had trained under him. But the machine he had built continued to operate. His training methods, his tactical doctrines, and his Lewis bombs remained, passed down to the men who would continue to carry out the mission he had designed. In the months that followed, the SAS conducted raid after raid against enemy airfields and installations. They became utterly dependent on the long-range Desert Group for transportation, and this dependency was both a strength and a limitation. The Desert Group's 3,000 trucks, nicknamed the Libyan Desert Taxi Service by the men they carried, were reliable and capable of covering enormous distances. But the Desert Group had its own critical missions, particularly the road Watch continuous surveillance of the via coastal highway to track Axis troop and supply movements. Scheduling. Conflicts became increasingly problematic. Different mission profiles meant that long-range desert group commanders sometimes refused to transport SAS raiders to targets they considered too dangerous or too far from their own areas of operation, and the simple loss of operational independence grated on Stirling, who believed the SAS should control its own destiny. The solution emerged gradually. Before acquiring Jeeps, Stirling reclaimed rolled Ford station wagon from a salvage depot in Cairo. The vehicle had been written off after an accident, but Stirling's men stripped off its damaged roof, mounted Vickers K machine guns on improvised mounts, and painted it in desert camouflage. They christened it the Blitz buggy, and though it was unreliable and prone to mechanical failure, it gave the SAS its first taste of vehicle independence. The real transformation came in June 1942 when the SAS acquired its first batch of American Willys Jeeps. These vehicles had been arriving in North Africa in increasing numbers as part of Lend-Lease shipments, and they were proving themselves remarkably capable in desert conditions. By July, at Paddy, Mayne's urging, Stirling returned to Cairo to procure a larger consignment. Through a combination of official requisitions and the unofficial acquisition methods at which the SAS had become expert, the unit soon possessed approximately 16 Jeeps and 20 Bedford 3 supply trucks, making them fully independent of desert group transport. But the standard Willys Jeep was not a weapon of war. It was a utility vehicle designed to carry personnel and light cargo. Transforming it into a desert raiding platform required modifications that would have astonished the engineers and who had designed it. The SAS drew heavily on techniques pioneered by Major Ralph, the founder of the Long-Range Desert Group and one of the foremost desert exploration experts in the world, had spent years before the war traveling the Sahara, learning its secrets and developing the equipment needed to survive and operate in its harsh environment. The first step was weight reduction. Canvas roofs, wind screens, doors, and any non-essential sheet metal were stripped from each Jeep. Every pound removed was a pound that didn't need to be carried across the sand, extending range and improving performance in soft terrain. Water condensers were fitted to the cooling system. These ingenious devices captured steam escaping from the radiator, condensed it in an external can, and returned the water to the system via vacuum pressure. In the furnace heat of the desert, a standard vehicle could lose gallons of coolant to evaporation. The condenser eliminated this problem, allowing vehicles to operate for hundreds of miles without needing to top up their radiators. Steel sand channels, another innovation, were strapped to the sides of each Jeep. When a vehicle became stuck in soft sand, which happened frequently, these perforated metal tracks could be placed under the wheels to provide traction for extraction. Navigation required special equipment. Standard magnetic compasses were unreliable near vehicle metal and in the featureless desert where there were no landmarks to check against. Sun compasses, which consisted of a graduated shadow disk with vertical needle, provided accurate directional readings regardless of magnetic interference. The navigator would set the disk according to the time of day and the sun's position, then maintain course by keeping the needle's shadow on the correct bearing. At night, navigation shifted to the stars using techniques that Jock Lewes had incorporated into SAS training. The most critical modification addressed the Jeep's limited range. The standard fuel tank held 15 gal, which provided less than 120 mi of travel in desert sand, where fuel consumption increased dramatically. This was completely inadequate for deep penetration raids that might require traveling 400 m or more behind enemy lines. Can racks were welded to rear mud guards and bonnet, creating capacity for 8 to 12 additional 5-gallon fuel cans. This expanded total fuel capacity to over 60 gallons, extending range past 400 miles. Similar racks carried water cans and spare parts. By the time all modifications were complete, each Jeep resembled a mechanical pack mule more than a military vehicle, but it was that made the SAS Jeep truly deadly. The key weapon was the Vickers K machine gun, also known as the Vickers. Gas-operated, this weapon had originally been designed as an observer's gun for Royal Air Force bombers, intended to be fired by rear gunners against attacking enemy fighters. When Browning machine guns replaced the Vickers K aircraft service, large numbers became available as surplus. The Vickers K's characteristics made it nearly ideal for run ground warfare, chambered in .303 caliber, the same as the standard British rifle, it could fire at an adjustable rate between 950 rounds per minute, significantly faster than the standard German infantry machine gun. It was fed by 100-round flat-pan magazines that could be changed quickly. The complete weapon weighed just 2912, light enough to be handled by a single operator. Most importantly for desert operations, the Vickers K's low-friction locking mechanism proved remarkably resistant to the sand that jammed and disabled other automatic weapons. A Vickers K could be fired reliably even when coated with the fine dust that penetrated everything in the desert environment. The standard SAS Jeep configuration mounted twin Vickers K guns forward on the passenger side and twin Vickers K guns on a swivel mount at the rear. This gave a single vehicle 4 weapons capable of producing a withering volume of fire. Some Jeeps also carried a 50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun at the rear for additional hitting power against armored targets or defensive positions. When loaded with a mixture of tracer, incendiary, and armor-piercing ammunition, these weapons could tear apart parked aircraft in seconds. Tracer rounds allowed gunners to adjust their aim in the darkness. Incendiary rounds ignited aviation fuel on contact. Combination was spectacularly destructive. The first test of vehicle-mounted tactics came during the airfield raid on the night of the 7th to 8th of July 1942. Mayne's team infiltrated the airfield on foot as usual and began planting Lewes bombs on parked aircraft. They placed charges on approximately 40 planes before discovering a problem. About half the bomb primers were damp, probably from condensation during the desert night, and failed to detonate. Only 22 aircraft were destroyed by the bombs. Frustrated by this partial success, Stirling improvised what would become the SAS's signature tactic. He led the Blitz buggy and 2 of the newly acquired Jeeps directly onto the airfield, driving between the rows of parked aircraft with all guns blazing. Tracer and rounds from Vickers ripped through wings, fuselages, and fuel tanks. Aircraft that had survived the bomb failures were systematically destroyed by gunfire. The SAS claimed 15 additional aircraft killed by this drive-in attack, bringing the total to roughly 37. It was the first vehicle-mounted airfield assault in history, and it demonstrated that the armed Jeep could be even more effective than raiders on foot. Bombs required time to place and relied on fuses that might fail. Guns delivered their destruction instantly and reliably. The tactic was perfected 3 weeks later in the most famous SAS raid of the Desert War. On the night of the 26th to 27th of July 1942, 18 armed Jeeps carrying approximately 60 British and Free French commandos assembled for an attack on Sidi Airfield. The force was led by Stirling personally, with Mayne commanding one of the Jeep columns. They departed their hideout at Bir El in the late afternoon and covered 50 mi of open desert, navigating by sun compass and then by stars as darkness fell. The navigator was Mike, Desert Group veteran who had transferred to the SAS and who would later be described as the finest desert navigator of the war. As the column approached the airfield perimeter around 10:00 in the evening, something unexpected happened. The runway lights suddenly switched on, illuminating rows of parked aircraft. For a moment the raiders feared they had been detected, then they realized the truth. A bomber was coming into land and the ground crew had lit up the field for the approach. The SAS had arrived at precisely the right moment, at approximately 15 minutes 10. Stirling fired a green Very flare, the signal to attack. The 18 Jeeps charged onto the airfield in a V formation, 9 vehicles in each column with gunners on each side firing outward at the parked aircraft. The noise was deafening. Tracer rounds carved bright lines through the darkness. Aircraft exploded as bullets found fuel tanks. German and Italian ground crew ran in all directions, some toward defensive positions, most simply fleeing the chaos. The attack lasted approximately 15 minutes. The SAS claimed 37 to 40 aircraft destroyed, including Junkers 87 dive bombers, Junkers 52 transport aircraft, and 109 fighters. However, German records examined after the war indicate the actual number was closer to 20 aircraft destroyed or badly damaged. Even this lower figure represented a stunning achievement. The SAS lost 1 man killed in the attack itself. Lance Bombardier John, 21 years old, was shot through the head while manning his machine gun. He was the only Allied casualty of the assault proper. The withdrawal did not go as smoothly. As dawn approached, the French SAS element, which had been assigned to a secondary target, found itself behind schedule. Tire punctures on the rough desert surface had slowed their progress, and they were caught in the open at first. Light by 4 German Stuckers, the aircraft made repeated strafing runs on the exposed jeeps. 2 vehicles were destroyed. A French paratrooper and philosopher who had written poetry about war and faith was hit in the shoulder and abdomen. He died approximately 13 hours later, surrounded by his comrades. His notebook, recovered after his death, contained a prayer that began with the words, "I bring before thee, Lord, the souls of the soldiers who are about to die." It would become the official prayer of the French airborne forces. Simultaneous and near-simultaneous raids compounded the damage inflicted that July. On the same night as the raid, French SAS teams attacked airfield while Mayne hit. A second raid on later in July destroyed more enemy bombers. July 1942 alone likely saw 75 to 85 Axis aircraft claimed destroyed by SAS Jeep raids, though confirmed kills were lower. By this point in the campaign, Stirling could report to Middle East headquarters that the SAS had claimed destruction of at least 143 Axis aircraft in just 6 months of operations, even accounting for the tendency of raiding forces to overcount their kills. The impact was unmistakable. The unit that headquarters had tried to strangle at birth was now producing results that could not be ignored. The cumulative effect of SAS raids provoked an increasingly desperate Axis response. Field Marshal Rommel reportedly stated that Stirling and his men caused him more harm and damage than any other unit of similar size within Allied forces. Stirling earned the nickname the Phantom Major, though sources dispute whether it was coined by German intelligence or the British press. The Germans implemented escalating countermeasures. Airfield security was dramatically increased. Guard posts were established around aircraft dispersal areas. Patrols were mounted at all hours. The problem was that these security measures required troops and troops assigned to guard area airfields were troops not available for the front lines. This was precisely the force-multiplying effect Stirling had predicted in his original memorandum. A few dozen SAS raiders were tying down hundreds of Axis soldiers. Mayne noted grimly after one raid that the enemy had posted a sentry on nearly every plane, but even this measure was not sufficient. Mayne simply knifed the sentries before placing his bombs. Axis intelligence also attempted more sophisticated countermeasures. They deployed a spy, the Anglo-Swiss fascist Church, who posed as a captured British officer in prisoner of war camps, to extract information from captured SAS men. A former French foreign legionnaire named, who had joined the SAS under false pretenses, betrayed upcoming raid plans to the Germans. Operations against airfields at and failed as a result, the targets having been evacuated before the raiders arrived. The most significant response came from the highest levels of the Nazi regime. On the 18th of October 1942, personally issued the commando order, known in German as the Commando Befehl, distributed in only 12 copies and classified as top secret. The order stated that all commandos operating against German forces were to be annihilated to the last man, regardless of whether they wore proper military uniforms or attempted to surrender. The commando order was motivated significantly by SAS operations along with other commando raids such as the Dep assault and Operation Basalt in the Channel Islands. It was a war crime, a violation of the laws of armed conflict that had protected prisoners of war since the 19th century. At the Nuremberg trials after the war, General Alfred was found guilty in part for his role in distributing and implementing the order. In June 1942 alone, the SAS claimed to have destroyed an estimated 8% of all German aircraft in North Africa, a staggering proportion for a unit of fewer than 200 men. Even if this figure was exaggerated, even if the actual percentage was half that, the strategic impact was immense. Estimating total aircraft destroyed by the SAS during the North African campaign requires navigating significant discrepancies between sources. The most rigorous academic figure comes from Allianz Rand Corporation's study titled Snakes in the Eagle's Nest, which documented 367 aircraft destroyed by all British special forces combined in the theater. This includes not just the SAS but also the Special Boat Service, the Desert Group, and agents of the Special Operations Executive. Other historians have produced higher estimates. Author Lewes, citing operational records in an interview with the Imperial War Museums, offered 3807 proven and approximately 450 probable. Destructions attributed to the SAS specifically. Conservative estimates begin around 250, the highest claims exceed 400. SAS was common and understandable. At the unit claimed 37 aircraft destroyed, while Axis records indicate approximately 25. At the SAS claimed 37 to 40, while German documentation shows closer to 20. Men attacking an airfield at night with bombs and bullets and fire everywhere naturally overestimated the damage they inflicted. Aircraft already might not be counted as losses in Axis records even if physically destroyed. Both sides had reasons to distort the numbers. What cannot be disputed is that a unit never exceeding a few hundred men inflicted damage equivalent to a conventional at negligible cost in men and material. The claim that the SAS destroyed more enemy aircraft than the Royal Air Force did in air combat during the same period is broadly accepted by the Imperial War Museums and multiple historians, though it may hold most precisely for specific months of 1942 rather than the entire campaign. Represented another side of the SAS, the backbone that balanced the aristocratic officers and celebrated warriors. Born on the 19th of March 1920 near in Cambridge, the son of farm laborer, Seekings had enlisted in the army despite being almost completely blind in one eye. Regulations should have barred him from service entirely, but he had memorized the eye chart and fooled the medical examiners. Original member of L Detachment, Seekings survived Operation Squatter and participated in 10 major raids during the North African campaign. He personally claimed destruction of more than 15 aircraft and rose from private to squadron sergeant major through merit and survival. He earned both the Distinguished Conduct Medal and the Military Medal, decorations normally awarded for extraordinary valor. Historians would later describe him as the great unsung hero of the wartime SAS and the power behind the thrones of Stirling and Mayne. The end of Stirling's personal war came on the 24th of January 1943 in southern Tunisia. SAS commander was leading a raiding party deep into enemy territory, attempting to become the first 8th Army unit to link up with 1st Army forces advancing from the west. Even Brigadier George had warned him he was pushing too close to the enemy, taking too many risks on too little intelligence. The warning proved. Stirling's party was detected by German patrols and forced to scatter. Stirling himself escaped the initial contact and found refuge among local Arab tribesmen. According to SAS tradition, these Arabs then sold his location to the Germans in exchange for goods or money. He escaped once from German custody but was recaptured by Italian forces and flown to Rome for interrogation. Stirling proved as resistant to captivity as he had been to authority. He made at least 4 escape attempts from various prisoner of war camps, once getting within miles of Switzerland before being recaptured. Eventually, the Germans transferred him to Kassel, the fortress in Saxony classified as escape-proof, where the most persistent Allied escapers were concentrated. Stirling spent the remainder of the war there, serving as chief of the escape committee and planning breaks that other men would execute. His capture initially sparked fears that the SAS would be disbanded. The unit had been so closely identified with its founder that many assumed it could not survive without him. Instead, Paddy Mayne assumed command on the 27th of January 1943 and led the unit through the remainder of the North African campaign. Under Mayne's leadership, the SAS participated in the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Spearheading the assault at Capo, David's brother Bill Stirling raised the 2nd SAS Regiment Algeria in May 1943, doubling the unit's strength. By September 1942, even before Stirling's capture, General had already granted the SAS full regimental status, the ultimate vindication of a concept that military bureaucrats had tried to strangle at birth. Mayne himself survived the war, though not by much. He was killed in a car accident in Northern Ireland in 1955, driving home from a late night out. His wartime decorations included the Distinguished Service Order with 3 bars, making him one of the most decorated British soldiers of the conflict. Even King George VI had inquired why the Victoria Cross had so strangely eluded him. The answer probably lay in Mayne's difficult personality and his history of conflict with superior officers. Valor alone was never sufficient for Britain's highest military honor, Field Marshal. Montgomery is said to have remarked that the boy Stirling is quite mad, quite mad. However, in a war there is often a place for mad people. Whether Montgomery actually said this has never been definitively confirmed, but the Sentiment captures something true about how the military establishment viewed the SAS and its founder, the commander of United States Delta Force, the American Special Operations Unit that traces its lineage directly to SAS. Methods and Traditions later wrote to Stirling with more respect. The common bond between the special forces of the Western world is that we all trace our roots back to you. The SAS's North African campaign represents one of military history's most striking examples of asymmetric warfare before that term existed, a unit conceived by lieutenant whom the establishment considered a gambler, opposed by the very headquarters meant to support it and nearly destroyed in its first operation, went on to inflict strategic-level damage with tactical-level resources. The core irony is inescapable. The vehicle that made British Special Forces deadly in the desert was not British at all. The Willys Jeep was designed in America, manufactured in Ohio, and shipped across the Atlantic as part of Lend-Lease. It was intended as a simple utility vehicle, a way to move personnel and cargo around military installations. No one at Willys Overland or at the United States Army had imagined it bristling with machine guns and racing across enemy airfields at night. The marriage of this humble American vehicle with surplus British aircraft machine guns created a weapon system that no military planner had envisioned. British ingenuity, American manufacturing, and the vast empty spaces of the North African desert combined to produce something unprecedented. The armed Jeep became not just a raiding platform but a symbol of unconventional thinking, of the willingness to improvise, adapt, and overcome that defined the SAS from its founding. What began as 66 men and a stolen piano in a desolate camp on the Great Bitter Lake became the blueprint for every special operations unit that followed. The descendants of L Detachment now serve in the special forces of every Western nation and many others besides. They carry different weapons and drive different vehicles, but they operate according to principles that David Stirling, Jock, Lewes, and Mayne developed in the Egyptian desert more than 80 years ago. The Willys Jeep has long since passed into history, replaced by purpose-built special operations vehicles with armor, night vision, and satellite navigation. But every one of those modern vehicles owes something to the sand-colored raiders that charged onto Sidi Airfield on a July night in 1942, guns blazing, proving that a handful of determined men with the right equipment and the right mindset could change the course of a